Hey everyone, and a massive, warm welcome back to the channel. Seriously, it's fantastic to have you joining us today. Before we dive into this absolutely crucial, and often harrowing, chapter of history, I'm sending the biggest, warmest wishes your way, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. I genuinely hope you're feeling healthy, strong, and ready to explore a story that reshaped an entire continent and echoes powerfully today. Take good care of yourselves. Now, picture this, it's the year 1880. The vast continent of Africa, 3 times the size of Europe, is a tapestry of incredibly diverse kingdoms, empires, city-states, and communities. For centuries, Europeans mostly hugged the coasts, trading, setting up forts, but the interior? That belonged to Africans. Fast forward just 20 years. By 1900, nearly the entire continent, over 90% of it, is suddenly painted in the colors of European empires. British red, French blue, German black-white-red, Belgian yellow, Portuguese green. Borders are drawn with rulers on maps in distant capitals, slicing through ancient lands and cultures. How did this happen so fast? What drove this incredible land grab, this frantic scramble for Africa? And what did it mean for the millions of people whose lives were turned upside down overnight? Buckle up, because we're journeying back to a time of empires, explorers, greed, and the brutal redrawing of a continent. This is the story of how Africa was carved up. To understand the scramble, we need to step back and see Africa before the Europeans stormed inland. This wasn't some empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a continent teeming with life, innovation, and complex political systems. Huge empires like the Ashanti in West Africa, with their dazzling gold wealth and sophisticated administration, commanded respect. The Sokoto Caliphate, a powerful Islamic state, dominated much of what is now northern Nigeria. In southern Africa, the Zulu kingdom, forged by the military genius of Shaka, was a formidable force. Ethiopia, with its ancient Christian monarchy, successfully defended its independence for centuries. Along the east coast, thriving Swahili city-states like Kilwa and Zanzibar bustled with trade, connected to the Indian Ocean world. There were hundreds of smaller kingdoms, chiefdoms, and stateless societies, each with their own languages, traditions, economies, and ways of life. Europeans weren't absent. For centuries, they'd been involved, but mainly around the edges. Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French traders had established forts and trading posts along the coasts. Their primary interests were specific and often grim, securing enslaved people for the transatlantic slave trade, which had peaked in the 18th century but was still significant, trading for gold, ivory, palm oil, and other valuable commodities. They relied heavily on African intermediaries, kings, merchants, and brokers, to bring goods from the interior. Venturing deep inland was dangerous. Diseases like malaria and yellow fever were deadly for Europeans, the terrain was challenging, and they faced resistance from powerful states. So, while European influence was present and often destructive, especially through the slave trade, direct political control was mostly limited to coastal enclaves. Africa, in 1880, was still overwhelmingly governed by Africans. So, what changed? What flipped the switch in the 1880s, turning European interest from coastal trading to a frantic race to conquer the entire continent? It wasn't just one thing, it was a perfect storm of factors converging. Economic hunger. Europe was industrializing rapidly. Factories needed raw materials, rubber for tires and insulation, palm oil for soap and lubricants, cotton for textiles, copper for wires, diamonds and gold. Africa seemed like a treasure trove waiting to be exploited. European capitalists and politicians also saw Africa as a vast, new market where they could sell their manufactured goods, from textiles to guns. Finding new places to invest surplus capital was another big driver. National pride and rivalry. This was the age of intense nationalism in Europe. Countries like newly unified Germany and Italy were eager to prove they were great powers on par with Britain and France. Acquiring colonies became a symbol of national prestige and strength. It became a competition. If your rival got a colony, you had to get one too, or bigger, or better. The fear of being left out or dominated fueled the rush. Technological edge. Advances suddenly made conquering Africa seem possible. Quinine, finally understood and used more effectively, offered some protection against malaria, the deadliest killer of Europeans. The development of rapid-firing rifles like the Maxim gun gave European armies a devastating advantage over forces often armed with muskets or spears. Steamships and railways allowed for faster movement of troops and supplies inland, overcoming previous logistical nightmares. The civilizing mission. Many Europeans genuinely believed in their racial and cultural superiority. They saw colonization as a duty, a white man's burden, to bring Christianity, European civilization, commerce, and an end to practices they deemed barbaric, like slavery within Africa, though European powers had fueled the transatlantic trade for centuries. This ideology, however patronizing and often hypocritical, provided a moral justification for conquest. Strategic choke points. Controlling key locations became crucial for global empires. Britain wanted to secure the route to India, its most valuable colony, hence its intense interest in Egypt and the Suez Canal, and later, controlling territory from Cairo to Cape Town. France dreamed of an empire stretching across Africa from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Seaports, river systems, and areas rich in resources became prime targets. All these pressures, money, pride, technology, ideology, and strategy, built up through the 1870s and early 1880s. The dam was about to break, and one man, King Leopold II of Belgium, would be the one to smash it wide open. King Leopold II of Belgium was obsessed with colonies. Belgium was a small, new country with no colonial history, but Leopold dreamed of grandeur and, more importantly, vast personal wealth. He cleverly disguised his ambitions as a humanitarian and scientific mission. In 1876, he hosted an international conference in Brussels, talking piously about opening up Central Africa to civilization, suppressing the Arab slave trade, and promoting science and commerce. Out of this came the misleadingly named International African Association, largely a front for Leopold's personal schemes. He hired the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley, fresh from his highly publicized finding of Dr. Livingstone, to carve a path through the Congo River basin. Stanley spent years, 1879 to 1884, signing treaties with hundreds of local chiefs, often through trickery, coercion, or simply misunderstanding. Chiefs likely saw these as trade or friendship pacts, not surrendering sovereignty. Leopold used these treaties to claim a gigantic territory in the heart of Africa, nearly 1 million square miles, as his personal property, not Belgium's, calling it the Congo Free State. News of Leopold's staggering land grab sent shockwaves through Europe. Other powers, particularly France and Portugal, who had old claims to the Congo mouth, were furious and alarmed. Suddenly, it seemed like the richest parts of Africa were being snapped up. The fear of missing out became panic. Every European government felt pressured to grab territory before it was all gone. Explorers, adventurers, and agents were dispatched frantically across the continent to plant flags, sign treaties, no matter how dubious, and claim land for their respective crowns. Africa was becoming a chaotic free-for-all, with overlapping claims and the very real threat of European powers clashing with each other over African soil. This dangerous instability is what led to the most infamous meeting of the Scramble, the Berlin Conference. To prevent European wars over Africa and to set some ground rules for this chaotic land grab, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck invited the major European powers, plus the USA and the Ottoman Empire, though they played minor roles, to a conference in Berlin in late 1884. Not a single African leader was invited. For several months, diplomats from Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, Spain, and others sat around tables with maps of Africa, negotiating the fate of a continent they barely understood. The Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, wasn't about drawing the exact borders of every colony. That happened later through bilateral treaties and wars. Instead, it set the rules of the game. The principle of effective occupation, this was crucial. Simply claiming a coastal strip was no longer enough to claim the vast hinterland behind it. To secure a claim over territory, a European power now had to prove it had some actual presence there, a treaty, a fort, administrators, and, importantly, that it could keep the area open for trade. This rule ironically accelerated the scramble, forcing powers to rush inland to physically stake their claims before rivals did. Free trade in the Congo Basin, the conference declared the Congo River Basin, essentially Leopold's territory, though he remained its personal owner, a free trade zone, meaning no single power could impose tariffs there. This pleased traders but did little for Africans. Navigating the Niger and Congo rivers, freedom of navigation was declared on these major rivers. The fate of Leopold's Congo, the conference formally recognized Leopold II's personal control over the Congo Free State. This was a catastrophic decision for the people of the Congo, as Leopold was now free to exploit it without even the minimal oversight of the Belgian parliament. Notification requirement. Powers had to notify others when they established a new protectorate or colony. The Berlin Conference effectively gave the scramble for Africa its official blessing and a set of European-approved rules. It didn't bring order, it licensed the chaos and systematized the partition. With the rules set, the race intensified. European powers sent soldiers, administrators, and concession companies into the interior with renewed urgency to turn their paper claims into effective occupation, regardless of the wishes or existing structures of the African societies they encountered. The conquest of Africa after Berlin was messy, brutal, and varied hugely across the continent. European powers employed different tactics, faced different levels of resistance, and had different resources. Military conquest, this was often the blunt instrument. European armies, equipped with Maxim guns, artillery, and disciplined formations, had a massive technological advantage. They fought wars against well-organized states, the British against the Ashanti, the Zulu, famously at Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, the Ndebele, the French against the powerful Mandinka Empire led by Samori Touré, a resistance that lasted nearly 20 years, and against Dahomey and its famous Amazons, the Germans against the Hihi and the Maji-Maji rebels in East Africa, the Italians against Ethiopia, leading to their disastrous defeat at Adwa in 1896. These wars were often incredibly bloody for the Africans, whose courage couldn't overcome the technological gap. Treaties and protection. Often, conquest began with diplomacy, but it was rarely equal. European agents, sometimes explorers, sometimes soldiers, sometimes missionaries, would approach African rulers. They offered treaties of friendship or protection, often promising security against enemies or trade benefits. The rulers, sometimes facing threats from neighboring states or seeing potential advantages, might sign. However, these treaties were frequently vague, misrepresented, or signed under pressure. Europeans would then interpret them as surrenders of sovereignty or requests for protectorate status, using them as legal justifications for takeover. Concession companies. To save money and effort, European governments sometimes granted huge chunks of territory to private companies. These companies, like Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company, BSAC, in Southern and Central Africa, or the Royal Niger Company in West Africa, or the German East Africa Company, were given powers to administer, make treaties, raise armies, and exploit resources. Their main goal was profit, often through brutal methods like forced labor to extract rubber or minerals. They were notoriously ruthless, provoking conflicts and imposing harsh regimes that often embarrassed the home governments and eventually led to the territories being taken over by direct colonial rule. Missionaries and explorers. While not conquerors themselves, Christian missionaries often paved the way. They established stations inland, learned local languages, and sometimes acted as intermediaries or sources of intelligence. Their presence could destabilize local societies, and their appeals for protection if threatened gave European governments excuses to intervene militarily. Explorers like Stanley provided the maps and the initial contacts that made the later conquest possible. Regardless of the method, the result was the same: African sovereignty was extinguished. By the early 1900s, only Liberia, settled by freed American slaves, and Ethiopia, which had stunningly defeated the Italians at Adwa in 1896, remained independent. The rest of the continent was under European flags. The experience of colonial rule varied depending on the colonizing power: British, indirect rule; French, assimilation and later, association; Portuguese, harsh exploitation; Belgian, brutality in the Congo; and the specific colony, but it was always based on European supremacy and African subordination. Economic exploitation. This was the core purpose. Colonies were designed to supply raw materials to the mother country and serve as markets for its goods. Africans were forced into new economic systems: cash crops. Villagers were often compelled to grow crops like cotton, cocoa, coffee, or peanuts for export, instead of food for themselves, leading to famines when prices dropped or crops failed. Mining. Huge mines for copper, Northern Rhodesia/Zambia; gold, South Africa; Gold Coast/Ghana; diamonds, South Africa; and other minerals were opened, relying heavily on African labor, often recruited through coercive systems like hut taxes that forced men to work for wages to pay the tax. Forced labor, particularly notorious in the Congo Free State under Leopold II, for rubber collection, and in Portuguese colonies, but used widely. Africans were forced to work on plantations, railways, roads, and other projects under brutal conditions, essentially as slaves in all but name. Land dispossession. Huge tracts of the best land, especially in settler colonies like Kenya, Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, Algeria, and South Africa, were taken from Africans and given to white settlers or designated as Crown land. This pushed Africans onto smaller, less fertile reserves. Political control. Europeans ruled. Direct rule. French, Portuguese, Belgians. European officials held almost all positions of real power down to the local level, trying to impose European laws and systems directly. Indirect rule. British, especially, they tried to rule through traditional African chiefs and structures. But these chiefs were often appointed or manipulated by the British, losing their legitimacy. Their power now came from the colonial state, not their people. Their role was largely to enforce colonial demands like tax collection and labor recruitment. Divide and rule. Colonial powers frequently exploited existing ethnic differences or even created new ones. They favored certain groups over others for jobs or education, fostering tensions that still plague Africa today. Social engineering and racism. European racial theories placed whites at the top and Africans at the bottom. Segregation was common, especially in settler colonies. Access to the best jobs, education, healthcare, and housing was reserved for whites. A tiny class of educated Africans, Evolus, in French colonies, was sometimes nurtured, but they faced strict limits and discrimination. Missionary schools provided education, but often focused on basic literacy and vocational skills, aiming to create obedient clerks and laborers, while undermining indigenous cultures and religions. Infrastructure for extraction, railways and roads were built, but primarily to move raw materials from mines and plantations to ports for export, not to connect African communities or foster internal trade. Ports were expanded for the same purpose. The infrastructure served the colonial economy, not African development. Africans did not submit passively to colonial conquest and rule. Resistance was constant, taking many forms, from full-scale wars during the initial conquest to ongoing defiance throughout the colonial period. Armed resistance during conquest, as mentioned, powerful states fought fiercely. Samori Touré's decades-long guerrilla war against the French in West Africa, the Mandinka resistance, the Zulu victories and eventual defeat, the Ashanti Wars, the Ndebele and Shona uprisings, Kimurenga, against the British South Africa Company in Rhodesia, the Herero and Nama genocide perpetrated by the Germans in Southwest Africa. Namibia, after their rebellion, the brave but ultimately doomed resistance of King Mkwawa of the Hihi against the Germans in East Africa, and the stunning Ethiopian victory at Adwa. These were wars for independence and sovereignty. Revolts against colonial rule, resistance continued long after the flags were raised. The Maji Maji Rebellion, 1905 to 1907. In German East Africa, Tanzania was one of the largest. It united many different ethnic groups under the belief that magic water, Maji, would turn German bullets into water. Despite initial success, the Germans crushed it with extreme brutality, including scorched earth tactics and starvation, leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths. Other major revolts included the Bambatha Rebellion, 1906, in Natal, South Africa, against a poll tax, the Chilembwe Uprising, 1915, in Nyasaland, Malawi, against forced labor and racial injustice during World War I, and countless smaller acts of defiance. Everyday resistance. Most resistance wasn't large-scale rebellion. It was the quiet, persistent refusal to fully comply. Working slowly on European farms or projects, hiding crops or livestock from tax collectors, smuggling goods, maintaining secret cultural practices and religious beliefs, refusing to send children to missionary schools, or simply moving away from areas of heavy colonial control. People found ways to preserve their dignity and autonomy within the oppressive system. Intellectual and political resistance. By the early 20th century, a new form of resistance emerged. A small but growing group of Western-educated Africans began to challenge colonialism intellectually and politically. They formed associations, wrote in newspapers, often facing censorship, petitioned colonial authorities, and later, demanded representation and reform. Figures like J.E. Casely Hayford, Gold Coast, Harry Thuku, Kenya, and the early members of the African National Congress, founded 1912 in South Africa, laid the groundwork for the nationalist movements that would eventually win independence. They used the tools of the colonizer, education, law, political organization, to fight for African rights and self-determination. Resistance, in all its forms, proved that colonial rule was never accepted, only imposed by force. The impact of the scramble for Africa and the subsequent colonial period was profound and devastating, leaving scars that are still visible and painful today. Arbitrary borders. This is perhaps the most obvious and enduring legacy. European powers drew borders at the Berlin Conference and through later treaties with absolutely no regard for existing ethnic groups, languages, kingdoms, or geographical realities. They used straight lines, rivers, or latitude/longitude, slicing through communities and lumping together hostile groups. This created artificial states like Nigeria, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and dozens of others. These borders trapped diverse and often rival peoples within single nations, creating a constant source of tension, conflict, and instability that plagues Africa to this day. Think of the civil wars in Nigeria, Sudan, Congo, Rwanda, many fueled by these colonial boundaries. Economic exploitation and underdevelopment. Colonial economies were designed solely to extract wealth for Europe. Infrastructure was built for export, not internal development. Local industries were discouraged to prevent competition with European goods. Economies became dangerously dependent on exporting one or two raw materials, making them vulnerable to price swings on the world market. The focus on cash crops sometimes led to food shortages and famines. The wealth generated flowed overwhelmingly out of Africa. This pattern of dependency and lack of diversified economies was a crippling inheritance for independent African nations. Social division and instilled racism. Colonial rule was fundamentally racist. Europeans were at the top of a rigid hierarchy, with Asians, brought in as laborers or traders, often in the middle, and Africans at the bottom. This institutionalized racism poisoned social relations. The policy of divide and rule deliberately exacerbated ethnic tensions, favoring some groups, martial races, collaborators, over others. These divisions were often formalized in colonial administration and became deep fault lines in post-independence politics, leading to discrimination, marginalization, and horrific conflicts like the Rwandan genocide. Cultural disruption and loss, colonial education systems, missionary activity, and the denigration of African traditions eroded indigenous cultures, languages, and knowledge systems. While Christianity and Islam spread, it was often at the expense of traditional beliefs and practices. Colonial authorities suppressed or co-opted traditional leadership structures. This cultural assault created deep psychological wounds and a sense of inferiority that took generations to overcome. Infrastructure and state structures. On a more positive, though complex, note, colonial rule did leave behind some infrastructure, railways, ports, roads, though built for extraction, modern administrative systems, and the concept of the nation-state. However, these institutions were designed for control and exploitation, not democratic governance or service to the African populace. Inheriting these structures, often with their authoritarian tendencies and bureaucratic inefficiencies, posed significant challenges for new African governments. The seeds of nationalism. Paradoxically, colonialism also planted the seeds of its own destruction. By bringing diverse peoples together within artificial borders, exposing them to Western ideas of nationalism and self-determination, often learned in colonial schools or during service in World War I and II, and creating a shared experience of oppression, colonialism fostered a new sense of African identity and a powerful desire for independence. The educated elite, the veterans who fought for European powers, and the masses suffering under colonial rule became the driving force for liberation. The scramble for Africa wasn't a distant historical event, it was a relatively short, frenzied burst of imperial aggression that fundamentally altered the destiny of a continent and the world. In barely 2 decades, a complex mosaic of independent African societies was forcibly incorporated into European empires through a combination of technological advantage, ruthless greed, national rivalry, and a misplaced sense of racial superiority. The Berlin Conference, held without a single African voice, provided the cynical rulebook for the carve-up. The consequences were, and remain, profound. The arbitrary borders drawn on European maps became the cages for nations yet unborn, creating a legacy of ethnic tension and conflict that continues to fuel violence. Colonial economies, designed solely for extraction, left behind patterns of dependency and underdevelopment that are incredibly difficult to break. The deep scars of racism, cultural denigration, and the brutal suppression of resistance shaped societies for generations. Yet, amidst this darkness, the enduring spirit of Africa is undeniable. Resistance, from the battlefields of Isanlawena and Ottawa to the everyday acts of defiance and the intellectual challenges of the early nationalists, proved that the imposition of colonial rule was never accepted. It was this spirit, forged in the fires of oppression and nurtured by the yearning for freedom, that would eventually lead to the wave of independence movements in the mid-20th century. The Scramble for Africa is a stark reminder of the destructive power of unchecked imperialism and racism. It's a story of how lines drawn in distant capitals can fracture communities and shape destinies for centuries. But it's also a testament to resilience. Understanding this pivotal, painful era is essential not just for grasping Africa's past, but for comprehending its present struggles and its hopes for the future. The echoes of the Scramble are still very much with us.